Hello, this is Group 10's review for the final exam, and we will be discussing strategic bombing. This video will cover Axis bombings at the beginning of the war that led to Allied responses. Additionally, it will also detail the escalation of Allied bombings as well as Japanese kamikaze attacks. Following World War I, advances in technology led to the development of warplanes capable of long-range bombardment of enemy strategic military targets, as well as civilian population centers. The question quickly emerged as to the morality of aerial bombing of civilian targets. Answers to this question began to take shape early on in World War II when Japan used aerial bombardment on two separate occasions in Shanghai against the Chinese. In the first attack, Japanese used carrier aircraft against Shanghai in 1937 and killed over 1,000 civilians, while the second attack killed many more Japanese in an even heavier bombardment. In 1938 and 1939, the United States attempted to establish some moral high ground in this area, with Congress passing legislation followed up by FDR's urging of all sides to refrain from bombing of innocent civilians. However, on September 25, 1939, a day referred to as Black Monday in Poland, the Germans conducted a massive aerial bombardment of Warsaw, using explosive and incendiary bombs to terrorize the Poles into rapid surrender. The Poles capitulated 2 days later. In May 1940, the Germans continued to use aerial bombardment as support to Blitzkrieg, as well as an instrument of terror designed to speed the enemy to surrender by bombing Rotterdam. This action actually took place after negotiations concluded that led to a ceasefire. In August of 1940, German aircraft accidentally bombed civilians as they headed toward a military target. Churchill immediately retaliated with an aerial attack on Berlin, which led Hitler to launch the 57-day attack on London referred to as the Blitz. This was a concentrated effort to attack civilians instead of military targets. Following the Blitz, the British responded with aerial bombing of Germany. As head of Bomber Command in Britain, Arthur Harris believed the British bombings of factories and industrial centers could knock the Germans out of war. Plus, in the early stages of the war, it was the only way the British could take the war to Germany. Harris famously said of the German bombings of Britain, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." British bombers attacked using night raids, which due to their inaccuracy led the Brits to switch from strategic bombing to terror bombing. This led to many massive attacks on cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin. However, in preparation for the invasion of Normandy, the British and US bombings in Germany were suspended until early 1945. The United States bombing of Germany began in 1942 under British Bomber Command led by the aforementioned Arthur Harris. However, in 1944, they were able to operate more independently. The Americans had a different philosophy, thinking their tight formations of bombers could bomb Germany in the daytime. This led to massive casualties in the bomber force until the addition of the P-51 Mustang, a plane with the performance of a fighter escort but the distance of a bomber. However, when these planes became operational, the US and Britain switched to interdiction bombing in France in preparation for the Normandy invasion. However, in early 1945, when bombing of Germany resumed, P-51 escorts allowed the British and American bombers to attack deep into Germany in broad daylight, causing much more extensive damage to infrastructure and more civilian deaths. It isn't exactly known, but US and British bombing during the war killed as many as 500,000 German civilians. By February of 1945, the Luftwaffe was destroyed, allowing Allied heavy bombers to push further into Germany. Dresden, a city largely untouched, was the focus of a 2-day bombing attack that burned a majority of the city to the ground and killed about 40,000 people, most of whom were civilians. The Allies felt that the city was a legitimate war target, while the Germans portrayed the event as an unnecessary murder of women and children. In the Pacific, the American island hopping campaign paid off by providing forward airfields in the Marianas for long-range heavy bombers to use in attacks against the Japanese home islands. In March of 1945, General Curtis LeMay changed bombing strategy by switching to low-altitude night raids and incendiary bombs in an effort to destroy urban and industrial areas with large fires. In less than 6 months of bombing, over 400,000 Japanese were killed from the air. Kamikaze, Japanese for divine wind, were suicide bombers. Although suicide actions had been prevalent earlier, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 was the first concerted effort by the Japanese kamikaze pilots, which, despite sinking the St. Lo, had a much bigger effect on the psyche of the Americans as they fully witnessed Japanese fanaticism. The Japanese turned to kamikazes more as a means to overcome American technological superiority and featured prevalently in Operation Tengo during the American invasion of Okinawa as they sunk 36 ships and caused massive casualties, killing nearly 5,000 American men throughout the war. As German scientists fled the Nazi regime in the late 1930s, they warned that Hitler was developing nuclear weapons. The British later confirmed the theoretical possibility of using uranium to produce a weapon, and President Roosevelt authorized the establishment of a secret group of people who would design and build an atomic bomb known as the Manhattan Project. The first bomb was tested on July 16, 1945, in New Mexico, and the remaining bombs were delivered to the island of Tinian in the Marianas. An ultimatum was issued to Japan on July 26th, with the first atomic bomb being dropped on August 6th on Hiroshima, killing 80,000 instantly and resigning an untold thousands to the fate of the hibakusha, or irradiated survivors of nuclear bombing. The second bomb was dropped on August 9th on Nagasaki, and the Japanese agreed to surrender 5 days later. The debate is ongoing as to whether bombing is morally tenable, with good arguments from both sides. It may have helped end the war sooner, but it also led to a lot of death and destruction. It was all contingent on one's perspective, whether you were the perpetrator or the victim. So it's hard for us to say who was right and who was wrong and whether or not bombing was morally tenable. This concludes Group 10's presentation for the final exam. Thank you very much for listening. Good luck. In World War II.